Welcome, guys, to day 2 of building a website, a step-by-step guide for beginners. On day 1, we had a look at what websites are, how you plan for a website, learning HTML, and the most commonly used HTML tags. On day 2, we are going to continue to play around with those most commonly used HTML tags, apply some basic CSS to it, and play around with layouts and wireframes. As a side note, everything that I'm saying, I'm not reading from a script. I'm saying it as it's coming in my head. So bear with me if I might pause somewhere because I'm trying to think, or those mistakes are going to happen because I'm not reading off anything. Everything that I'm saying, I'm thinking as I'm saying it, and then I might have another thought that overrides that thought. So just bear with me. So let's get started. Now, this is the basic HTML structure that we looked at previously and the basic HTML tags. And these are the tags that we're going to play around with. If maybe there will be more tags that we will need, then I will amend that as we go. The important thing to note here is that there's no need to memorize these tags. There's no need to, okay, you can write them down as the most commonly used HTML tags and their use cases. But what is important here is that you shouldn't try to memorize anything. Let Google be your uncle. And what I mean by that is if, because remember to apply an HTML tag or to use an HTML element one, you need to know what do you want to show. Is it an image? Is it text? Is it is it a link? The minute you understand what kind of a resource you want to show, then you can go to Google and just ask Google how to show text on HTML page, how to show an image on HTML page, and then it will give you the samples of the HTML tag or the HTML tag to use. So there's no need to memorize any of this. And the more you do this, the more you won't have to even go to Google anymore because you will just know them on top of your head. So for now, it's okay if you feel like you don't understand or know these things um, on top of your head. That's fine. It is bound to happen. So anyway, with that being said, uh, I'm gonna add some text here on my heading. Now let's assume that. So if I run this, um, so as a reminder, everything that I'm doing here, I'm doing it on an IDE, which is where we are writing the HTML code. You can do the same on Visual Code, which is a text editor, or use Notepad++. But as I have already said, that I will suggest using a Visual Code to code this HTML. And if I get to 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 HTML to use Visual Code in this video, then I will explain a bit why I prefer or why I would suggest that as a beginner you use Visual Code than or Notepad or which one. I think it's just Notepad for now, but I'll explain more as I go to the Visual Code. The only reason why I'm using the online IDE here is because what I'm going to showcase in this video needs I need to browse some pages, especially when we are going to look at different layouts. I need to browse some pages, so I can't split between the browser and my Visual Code. So if I'm using a browser, it has to be a browser. If I'm using Visual Code, it has to be Visual Code. And again, because I'm trying to avoid having to edit this video, I'm trying to be as authentic as possible so that you get the unedited version of the video. You want to get the video with all of those mistakes or all of those um, pauses or silence, and so I want it to be authentic as possible. So now back to the IDE. Assume that I have the heading, the text heading, and assume that I wanted this heading to be a different color. I don't want it to be black. I want it to be red, green, whatever color that I want it to be. So in this case, I will change it to red. I want it to be red. With pure HTML, there's no way to change the color of this text. By default, all the text is black by default. Then to change the text, that's where CSS, cascading style sheets, comes in. CSS is what we use to style or decorate an HTML element. So to apply CSS to an HTML element, in the opening tag, which is the leftmost the left side tag, inside that tag, you need to add something like this. So it's the keyword style, equal sign, and quotes. Can be single quotes, can be double quotes, but preferably double quotes. And then color is the property that we want to change the value of or set the value of. Instead of equal sign, we use the semicolon to assign a value. So we'll say red. Then now our text is red. CSS, there are multiple ways to apply CSS. I can apply CSS inside the opening tag of an HTML element, which is known as inline styling, or I can put it inside the head tags. Preferably, if you are going to, there's actually three ways. The one way is inline, then the second is inside the head tag, and then the third is using an external file. So to keep things simple for now, I will explore all of those examples so you see how everything comes together and why you should put why you should do inline styling versus the styling in the head tags versus using just a different file. So for now, we're gonna stick to inline styling. So this is basically how you apply CSS to an HTML tag. How you apply the styling to an HTML tag is the same across all the tags. It doesn't matter what tag it is, it's the same. You will always have this keyword, the equal sign, and codes, and then inside the codes, that's where you are going to add the properties that you want. The color here is the property and the red is the value. So with color, it's a bit different. With color, you can use the actual color in the sense of the English word. You can use that color like red. You can type in red. If it's blue, you can type in blue. If it's green, you can type green. But we also have what they call hex colors, which looks something like it will be hash and followed by some digit, a hex number. The reason for these hex numbers is because sometimes you want a color that you can't exactly define using the English word. That's where the hex comes in. but it's all preference. You can either use hex or you can use uh, or you can use so you can either use the hex color or use the actual weighting for the color. So yeah, that's color. There are different properties, and each element, most elements will have the common properties, and some will have properties that are very specific to that element. Again, there's no need to memorize all of these properties. Google is your uncle. So that's how I apply the red color to this. And yeah, basically that's CSS. Now we're gonna go to layouts, understanding layouts, and play around with some layouts and do wireframes and I think for today we will end it there at designing a wireframe. Now a wireframe is just a blueprint of a layout, how the layout underneath looks like. If I were to say sketch something, sketch. Okay, here's a building. Sketch the blueprint of that building. So you're just going to draw some lines and pretty much some lines. Just going to draw some lines. So a wireframe is exactly the very same thing. We're just going to draw some lines. This is the site that we are going to replicate the design of. And now we need to create the wireframe for this design. Over time, as you get good at and you're more experienced, you can visualize the wireframe. So there won't be a need to actually write or draw it down. You can just visualize it. For the purpose of this demonstration, I am going to draw it. So we have a div over here. We have anchor over here, sorry, and text, video here, and some text here, and then an image here for the beggar, for the menu. This is called the beggar icon because it looks like a beggar. Okay, so now the wireframe for this layout looks something like this. Remember, as you are going to start implementing or designing your website, you need to think of it as a white canvas, a blank canvas, and it's square shaped. Something like this. Something like this. Just blank. Now it's time to start drawing. So looking at this layout, we have anchor here, we have text on the right. So if we were to use positioning to explain this layout, it's anchor on the left. And why am I saying this is an anchor? Because if you hover over it, the cursor changes to an arrow to show that this is clickable. And then text on the right, and video on the middle, and text towards the bottom. Well, at the bottom, text at the bottom, and the beggar icon on the right, center on the right, and horizontally centered. So the layout for that looks something like this. What am I looking for? What element am I looking for? Yep, okay. To represent the elements, I'm just going to use these blocks, and I will explain why I'm using the blocks. Yep. So the layout for that website looks something like this. This is the logo on the left, the text on the right, and the beggar menu. On the middle or at the center, then we have the video and the text. The reason why I'm using blocks, these blocks represent a div, the div tag. The div tag is it's for layout and structure. So I'm using these blocks because a div is a block. And by default, a div will take 100% width. I feel like I might be losing some people here. So let me try to explain it a different way. To implement a website or a design, we are going to use divs to create the layout, to create the foundation, to create the blueprint, if you may. If you add a div is for layout, meaning it doesn't show anything. Then inside this div, then you can place stuff like that heading. The reason why I will say always use divs around elements. Don't just place an HTML element outside a div. Always place it inside a div. It's so that later on, when you want to do a responsive design, it becomes a bit easier. And also divs, they are easier to create layout with and do all of the positioning and everything like that. Because now remember, you're starting off on a blank canvas. So if I wanted an HTML element at the top right, I need to position it at the top right. So think of a layout like this, or as this blank canvas, think of it as columns and rows. Columns, think of it as columns and rows. So think of it as columns and rows. When you look at this design and you're looking at column, 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 and row, 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 when you look at it that way, so if you were to add a div, if you were to add a div, I'm just adding a border to the div to show you what a div looks like. A div looks like this. It doesn't have a height, but it has a width. We are working off a two-dimensional space. That is, each element will have a width and it will have a height. A div by default has a width of 100%, which is it takes up the entire space. It takes up the entire space of the parent. So not to confuse anyone here, I'm just going to, I'll explain a little better as we go on into the video. Well, as we play around with divs. So a div will always take a width of 100%. That means it will always start here and end on the right. If you wanted the div to only take a portion, that's where you will need to use the width, change the width. With width, you can use pixels, which is px, or percentages. I prefer using percentages for it becomes easier when you need to do the responsive design. It becomes easier when you use position than pixels. 2% on any screen is 2%, but 2 pixels on any screen is different depending on the screen that you are on. So if I were to say 20%, then now our div is 20%. And you can play around with the height, with the width to get the width that you want. If I were to increase this to 30, you'll see that this will keep increasing. And if I wanted to increase the height, I just need to use the property height and I set it to, let's say, 10%. Let me add something here so it can show the height. Otherwise, doesn't make sense to add height to a div if it's empty. So that's what our div looks like. If I didn't add any of this, it will look something like this. It will still take up the entire space, and then the height will wrap around the content inside it. This is a div. Now looking at this website, the wireframe is going to look something like what I had before. You're going to have this on the left, this on the right, something at the center, another div at the center, and div on the right. Everything here is going to be included inside a div. So we're going to have one div that houses everything else. A div can have nested divs. An HTML tag, an HTML element can have, well, some, not all, some can have nested elements inside them, especially if there are layout kind of HTML tags like a div. You can have nested elements inside it, including other divs. So this is the design that this is the structure. The wireframe, it looks like this. It's a div that houses everything and a bunch of divs inside, and we're going to position them where they are here. And think of everything as columns and rows. Column, 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 and then row and row. Looking at this design, is 2 rows and 1, 2, 3, 4, and 4 columns. If we look at a different design, which one can I look at? One that is a bit easier to understand. Okay, so here's another layout. So this layout, if we were to think of this layout as columns and rows, we're gonna have one row and 2 columns underneath. The design for that one will look something like this. And then you have 2 columns at the center. So the layout for this one to look something like this. Again, everything will be inside a div. All these blocks that I'm creating here, they are divs, which are going to be housed inside one massive div. Whenever you see a block, just know it's a div. So inside this div, that's where we're going to add the text, the buttons, the text fields, whatever elements that we want. So when you look at a design like this, always think of it like this. Makes it easier to implement. Then in the next video, we're going to continue translating this wireframe into an actual page like this. So we're going to have this in here. And I believe that's when now I'm actually going to move to visual code because we have the wireframe done. We understand a bit of layouts. We can play around with different websites, try to see the underneath structure. Can you even see the underneath structure? But always remember, think of when you look at a website, a web page, think of columns and rows. Always think of columns and rows. But the one that we'll be doing, it's this one. And remember that this is just a wireframe. There's no need for it to be pretty, as long as it outlines or gives an idea of where the elements or the divs are going to be positioned. So the one we're going to have will look something like this, with one big div that houses everything. So that's what we'll be looking at in day 3. And that's it. I always plan that the videos are less than 15 minutes or at least 20 minutes worst case, but it seems like they always go over that. And yeah, I guess that's what happens when you don't read of a script. You sometimes go, you sometimes, because you don't have this thing that you're sticking to, you just go wherever the thought leads. And I suppose that's why I always go over 20 minutes. But anyway, so for now, this is it. On the next video, we're gonna continue. We're actually gonna start doing the heavy lifting. So for now, I think just play around with CSS, try to understand why you would want to use CSS, apply CSS, Not necessarily that you need to memorize all the properties and the values. Everything will come in as you learn. As you learn, everything will come in and stay in your head. So for now, you can either do that, play around with some CSS, or try to Google and see different CSS properties, or just don't, and we can carry on. I mean, it's all about over time. Over time, you will know these things. So for now, no need to be too hard on yourself. You're still learning. So far, it feels like, it might feel like, but I haven't really learned this out of the blue, this magic thing that I feel like I'm ready. But trust me, you are. Once everything start coming together, you will see why the first few days or the last 2 days, the last day and this one, were more theory than practical. So anyway, now I'm rambling a lot. So before I even start talking a lot, I'm just gonna cut it here and see you on the next one. I'm Young. I'm out.